She took off without clearance, and the tower screamed through the radio to stop, but her hands were already on the throttles pushing forward, and the C-17 Globemaster was rolling down that runway in Caracas, with 134 Americans in the back, and Venezuelan military trucks closing in from both sides with armed soldiers, and she had maybe 40 seconds before they blocked the entire strip, and her co-pilot was yelling that they didn't have authorization, and she just said one thing that would define everything that came next: "If I don't go now, we die here." And she pushed those engines to full power and lifted 78,000 pounds of aircraft into the night sky, while bullets from the ground tore through the darkness and missed the fuselage by inches. And what happened in the next 11 minutes would almost start an international war and end her career, but save every single person on that plane, and nobody outside the Pentagon knows the full story until right now. April 19th, 2019, and Caracas was burning. Not metaphorically, literally burning. You could see the orange glow from fires across the city as Captain Sarah Mitchell brought the massive C-17 transport down through the darkness towards Simón Bolívar International Airport. The Venezuelan capital was in the middle of a political meltdown that had been building for months. Nicolás Maduro was clinging to power with his fingernails, while Juan Guaidó, recognized by over 50 countries as the legitimate president, was trying to rally a population that was starving and desperate. The United States had backed Guaidó hard, imposed crushing sanctions on Maduro's regime, frozen billions in assets, and made it very clear whose side they were on. And Maduro had responded by turning up the heat on every American still in the country. Diplomats were being followed. Contractors were getting death threats. Journalists who reported on regime atrocities were disappearing. The American embassy had already pulled out most of its staff, but there were still over 100 people trapped in Venezuela who needed to get out before things got worse. That's where Sarah came in. She was 34 years old, born in Colorado Springs, daughter of a Gulf War veteran who told her stories about flying over Iraqi deserts when she was 7. She'd wanted to be a fighter pilot her whole life, wanted the speed and the dogfights and the glory of Top Gun, but the Air Force had other plans and put her in transport aviation instead. She'd spent 10 years flying the C-17. This absolute beast of an aircraft that's 174 feet long with a wingspan that could cover half a football field, and she'd logged over 2,000 hours in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. She'd landed on blown-out runways in Afghanistan while mortars fell a mile away. She'd taken off from damaged strips in Iraq with warning lights flashing and engines screaming. She knew pressure. She knew how to handle chaos. But nothing in her training had prepared her for what was waiting in Caracas that night. The mission brief was simple on paper. Fly into Caracas after dark, land at the international airport, pick up 80 American personnel who'd been cleared and vetted by both the State Department and the Pentagon, and get out before sunrise, in and out in under 2 hours, low profile, no drama. But Venezuela in April 2019 didn't do simple. The moment Sarah's wheels touched down on that cracked asphalt runway, she knew something was wrong. The airport was half dark, running on emergency generators because the power grid had collapsed weeks earlier. There was barely any ground crew, just a skeleton staff in the tower and a handful of security lights that made the whole place look like a ghost town. She taxied to the hardstand away from the main terminal, cut the engines, and dropped the ramp. And that's when the plan fell apart. The manifest said 80 people who'd been approved, documented, ready to go, but when the buses pulled up, there were way more than 80. There were families with children who couldn't stop crying. There were elderly contractors who'd worked for American companies and now had targets painted on their backs. There were journalists who'd reported on Maduro's atrocities and received explicit death threats. There were people who weren't on any official list, but were desperate enough to risk everything on the chance that this American aircraft might be their last ticket out of hell. Major Kenneth Daniels, the Marine Ground Operations Commander, walked up to the cockpit, and Sarah could see the sweat pouring down his face, even though the night air was cool. She asked him how many, and he hesitated before answering. 134. Sarah's stomach dropped because the C-17 can technically carry that many people, but not comfortably, not safely, and definitely not when the mission parameters called for a fast, low-profile extraction that nobody was supposed to notice. She looked past Daniels and saw them, all these faces staring up at the aircraft like it was the last lifeboat on the Titanic, and she knew in that moment she couldn't leave them behind. She told Daniels to get them on board fast, and he started barking orders, and the Loadmaster Staff Sergeant Jason Chen was already directing people up the ramp, trying to organize the chaos. But there was no hiding it. People were crying and praying, and some just stared with this hollow look like they'd seen too much and couldn't process any more. Sarah stayed in the cockpit running pre-flight checks, calculating fuel load and weight distribution and takeoff speed, and her co-pilot Lieutenant Marcus Reed was plotting their route out of Venezuelan airspace. They'd fly low and hug the coast and cross into Colombia as fast as possible. It should have been simple. Except nothing was simple anymore, because that's when the radio crackled with a voice that made Sarah's hand freeze over the throttle. American aircraft, this is Venezuelan Air Defense Command. You do not have clearance for departure. Shut down your engines immediately. It wasn't the tower. It was military. Sarah tried to reach their command center in Bogotá, but all she got was static. Someone was jamming their communications, and then she looked out the cockpit window and saw headlights in the distance, multiple vehicles moving fast across the tarmac. Military trucks and armed personnel carriers. She counted at least 6, maybe more, and they were heading straight for the C-17. Marcus saw them too and said, "Sarah, we need to go now." And she knew he was right, but the ramp was still down and people were still boarding. She couldn't seal the aircraft and take off with civilians halfway up that ramp. She switched to internal comms and asked Chen how much longer, and he said 2 minutes, maybe 3. "We've got kids. Captain, they can't move fast." But Sarah didn't have 3 minutes because those vehicles were less than a kilometer away now, close enough that she could see armed men in the back, weapons silhouetted against the dim airport lights. She gave Chen 30 seconds, told him everyone on board in 30 seconds or we leave without them. It was a bluff, because she wouldn't actually leave them, but she needed people to move faster. Those next 2 minutes were the longest of her life. She watched the vehicles closing in. She watched Daniels and his team physically lifting people onto the ramp. She watched Marcus's hands shaking as he completed the engine start sequence. She heard the turbines spinning up, that deep, powerful roar she'd heard 1,000 times before, but never like this. Never with the weight of knowing that starting those engines was a point of no return. If she took off without clearance in hostile airspace with Venezuelan military forces actively trying to stop her, it could be considered an act of war. She could be starting an international incident that would dominate headlines for months. She could be throwing away her career, her freedom, maybe her life. But if she didn't take off, the people behind her would die, maybe not immediately, but they'd be arrested, detained, used as bargaining chips. And in Maduro's Venezuela, detention was often a death sentence. Chen's voice crackled through the comms, "Ramp up, everyone's on board," and Sarah ordered him to seal it. The hydraulics groaned as the massive rear ramp began to close. Sarah's hands moved to the throttle, but she hesitated because the vehicles were less than 300 meters away now, and she could see muzzle flashes. Warning shots firing into the air, or maybe not warning shots. Maybe they were aiming low, trying to hit the tires and disable the aircraft. Marcus was staring at her, waiting for the order, and the entire crew was waiting, and 134 people in the cargo hold were waiting, and Sarah felt the weight of it all pressing down on her like gravity itself. She thought about her training, about the rulebook, about the chain of command and proper authorization, and the careful diplomatic dance that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. And then she thought about something her father had told her years ago, the night before she left for officer training. Sometimes You have to make a decision that no one can make for you, and you live with it or you don't, but you make it. If I don't go now, she said quietly, we die here. And she pushed the throttles forward. The 4 Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines roared to life, each one generating over 40,000 pounds of thrust, and the aircraft lurched forward heavy and sluggish, with the weight of too many people and not enough preparation. Sarah released the brakes, and the Globemaster began to roll, slowly at first, and the runway at Simón Bolívar was just over 3,000 meters long, which is enough for a normal takeoff, but this wasn't normal. She was overweight. She hadn't calculated exact load distribution. She was taking off at night in a hostile environment, with vehicles now racing parallel to the runway, trying to cut her off. Marcus called out speeds, 40 knots, 60 knots, 80, and Sarah kept her eyes locked on the runway ahead, her hands steady on the yoke, even as the vehicles closed in from the left, trying to intercept before she reached takeoff speed. She saw the muzzle flashes again, and this time she heard them. The sharp crack of rifle fire, bullets hitting the tarmac, some hitting the aircraft. The C-17's fuselage is tough, built to take damage, but a lucky shot to the engines or the landing gear could end this before it started. 100 knots, and she needed 130 to rotate, to pull the nose up and get airborne. But there was a bigger problem at the far end of the runway where she saw more vehicles. They'd blocked the exit. A truck parked sideways across the taxiway, with armed men taking positions behind it. If she didn't get airborne before she reached them, she'd either have to abort or crash straight into them. 110 knots, and the vibration of the engines was shaking the entire airframe. She could hear things rattling in the cargo hold, could imagine the terror of the passengers feeling the aircraft accelerating into what must have felt like certain death. Marcus was gripping the edge of his seat, saying, "Sarah, we're not going to make it. We're not going to clear them." And she just kept accelerating. 120 knots, and she could see the men at the end of the runway raising their weapons. She could see that truck solid and immovable, and she had maybe 10 seconds to decide, abort and surrender, or commit. 125 knots, and she pulled back on the yoke. The nose of the C-17 lifted, the main landing gear still screaming down the runway, but the aircraft was rotating, the wings beginning to generate lift. 130 knots, and she pulled harder. "Come on," she whispered, "come on," and the main gear lifted off the ground. For a fraction of a second, the entire aircraft was airborne, but too low, too slow, that truck rushing at them like a wall. And then the C-17 climbed, not gracefully, not smoothly, but it climbed. The landing gear cleared the truck by what felt like inches. Marcus let out a breath he'd been holding for 30 seconds, but Sarah didn't. She just kept pulling, kept the nose up, kept the aircraft climbing because they were airborne, but they weren't safe, not even close. Venezuelan airspace extended 12 miles from the coast, and she had to cover that distance before the regime scrambled jets or activated surface-to-air missiles. The C-17 isn't a fighter. It has no countermeasures, no weapons, no way to defend itself except speed and altitude. She kept the throttles at maximum, climbing as fast as the overloaded aircraft would allow. Marcus was on the radio trying to reach Bogotá, trying to get someone, anyone, to confirm they were still on mission and not flying a rogue aircraft into an international crisis. The radio was silent for what felt like forever, and then finally it crackled to life. "Reach 79er, this is Bogotá, control. We have you on radar. You are cleared into Colombian airspace. Maintain current heading." Sarah felt her shoulders sag. They were clear, they were out, and she leveled off at 10,000 feet and let the autopilot take over, her hands finally releasing their death grip on the controls. Marcus looked at her, his face pale and his uniform soaked with sweat, and said, "You just took off without clearance in hostile airspace under fire." And she didn't respond because she was staring out at the black expanse of the Caribbean, her mind still racing, still processing what had just happened. Behind her in the cargo hold, 134 people sat in silence. No one was celebrating. No one was cheering. They were just holding on to each other, realizing they were alive. 2 hours later, Sarah landed the C-17 at El Dorado International Airport in Bogotá. The ramp lowered and the passengers disembarked. Some thanked her, some couldn't speak, some just walked away with their eyes still carrying the weight of what they'd left behind. Daniels approached her as she shut down the engines, and he didn't say anything at first, then quietly said that was the bravest thing I've ever seen, or the craziest. And Sarah looked at him and said, still not sure which, and he smiled and said, neither am I, but 134 people are breathing because of it. That night, while the passengers were processed and debriefed and while the aircraft was inspected for damage, 3 bullet holes in the fuselage, none critical, Sarah sat alone in a briefing room and waited because she knew what was coming. The questions, the investigation, the potential consequences of what she'd done. The blowback arrived faster than she expected. Within 12 hours, the Venezuelan government had released a statement condemning the unauthorized departure of an American military aircraft from Caracas, calling it a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. Maduro himself appeared on state television surrounded by uniformed generals, declaring it an act of aggression that proved the United States was preparing for invasion. The footage played on loop across international media, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, all running the same story. American military aircraft flees Venezuela under fire. Diplomatic crisis looms. But the American response was muted. The State Department issued a brief statement confirming that personnel had been evacuated from Venezuela due to security concerns, but declined to comment on operational details. The Pentagon said even less. A single line, all personnel and aircraft returned safely, no further comment. Sarah wasn't allowed to speak to the press, wasn't allowed to speak to anyone outside the chain of command. For 3 days she sat in a small office at the U.S. Embassy in Bogotá, waiting. On the 4th day she was flown to Washington, not to Joint Base Charleston, not back to her unit, but to the Pentagon. She was escorted through corridors she'd only seen in movies, past offices with names on the doors that appeared in history books, and she was brought to a windowless conference room where 5 officers sat behind a long table, 3 generals, a colonel from JAG, and a 2-star admiral who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Captain Mitchell, the admiral, began, "Do you understand why you're here?" And Sarah stood at attention with her hands behind her back and said, "Yes, sir. You took off from a foreign airport without clearance. You ignored direct orders from a sovereign nation's air defense command. You endangered your crew and passengers by operating in a hostile environment." Sarah said, "Yes, sir." The admiral leaned forward and said, "You also saved 134 lives, and you didn't start a war." Sarah blinked because that was not what she'd expected to hear. The general on the left, a 3-star with a chest full of ribbons, spoke next in a gruff voice that had commanded troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. "What you did, Captain, was technically a violation of a dozen different regulations. If we wanted to, we could court-martial you. We could end your career." There was a long silence. "But we're not going to do that." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. "Instead, you're being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. The ceremony will be private, no press, no publicity. Officially, this mission is still classified. You will not discuss it. You will not write about it. You will not confirm or deny anything to anyone outside this room. Do you understand?" She nodded and said, "Yes, sir." The ceremony took place a week later in a small room at the Pentagon. No cameras, no audience, just the same 5 officers and Sarah's family. Her father, now in his 70s, stood with tears in his eyes as the medal was pinned to her uniform. He didn't say anything because he didn't need to. Afterward she was reassigned, not punished, but moved, quietly transferred to a training command in Alabama, where she would spend the next year teaching the next generation of C-17 pilots. It was a good assignment, respectable, safe, But it wasn't flying missions, it wasn't the edge, and part of her missed that. For months, she didn't talk about what happened, not to her friends, not to her fellow pilots, not even to Marcus, who'd been transferred to a different base, and whom she only saw once, briefly, at a conference in Nevada, where they exchanged a look and a nod, and that was it. But the 134 people who'd been on that plane didn't forget. Some of them reached out with letters and emails and messages through official channels, thanking her and telling her their stories. One woman, a journalist named Elena Vasquez, who'd been on the flight with her 2 children, sent a handwritten letter that Sarah kept in her desk drawer. "You didn't just save our lives," Elena wrote. "You gave us a future. My children are in school now. They're safe, they're happy, and every night before they go to sleep I tell them about the pilot who didn't hesitate." Months turned into a year, and the headlines about Venezuela faded. Maduro remained in power, the crisis continued, and the world moved on to the next disaster. But Sarah carried it with her, not as a burden, not as trauma, but as a weight she'd chosen to bear, because that's what command was, that's what decisions were. You make them in the moment when no one else can, and you live with them forever. 2 years after Caracas, Sarah was promoted to major, and she returned to active airlift operations, flying missions across the Middle East and Africa. She never spoke publicly about Venezuela. When people asked, she gave the official line, "Classified, can't discuss it." But sometimes, late at night, when she was alone in a cockpit flying over some distant ocean, she thought about that moment. The moment when she pushed the throttles forward and committed to a decision that could have destroyed everything. And she wondered if she'd do it again. The answer was always the same, yes, because in the end it wasn't about regulations or diplomacy or politics. It was about 134 people who deserved a chance, and a pilot who refused to let them die, waiting for permission to live. Sarah Mitchell still flies today. She's never given an interview, never written a memoir, never sought recognition for what happened, but the people who were there remember, and they tell their children and they tell their friends. And somewhere in the quiet corners of military briefings and classified reports her name appears: Captain Mitchell, Caracas, April 19th, emergency evacuation under hostile fire, and underneath in the dry language of official assessments, a single line: mission accomplished, all personnel recovered, no casualties. There are stories the world forgets, stories that don't make it into the history books because they're too messy, too complicated, too classified to share. But we keep telling them, because somewhere in the gap between what's written down and what actually happened, there's truth and courage, and the kind of human decision that defines what it means to stand at the edge and choose to jump. If this story made you think about the impossible choices people face when seconds matter and lives hang in the balance, if it reminded you that real courage isn't always loud or celebrated but quiet and determined, then you need to hear more stories like this, because there are hundreds of them. Missions that never made the news, pilots and soldiers and operators who made decisions that saved lives and changed history and never got recognized for it. And we're going to keep bringing them to you every single week. So make sure you're subscribed, because these stories matter, not because they're about war or planes or politics, but because they're about people who face impossible choices and choose anyway, and that's something worth remembering. Claudia é uma IA e pode cometer erros. Por favor, verifique as respostas.